Japan is considering sending Ukraine humanitarian supplies such as food and winter clothing via Poland. The goods could be transported with a government aircraft of the Japanese Self-Defense Forces, as the Japanese television broadcaster NHK reported on Friday. Prime Minister Fumio Kishida recently announced after a phone call with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky that his country would support Ukraine with humanitarian aid worth $100 million. While financial aid is important, Japan should also think about providing relief supplies such as medicines, NHK quoted Kishida as saying. The provision of bulletproof vests is also being considered. In a second round of negotiations, Russia and Ukraine have agreed on the creation of humanitarian corridors in particularly hard-fought areas of Ukraine. That's what representatives of both sides said after the meeting. According to the Belarusian agency Belta, Ukrainian presidential advisor Mikhailo Podolyak said there should be a third round of negotiations early next week. At the same time, Podolyak emphasized that some hoped-for results were not achieved at the meeting in the Belarusian-Polish border area. The head of the Russian delegation, Vladimir Medinsky, spoke of a possible temporary cessation of hostilities in the relevant areas for the period of the evacuation. Podolyak said the humanitarian corridors should also be used to provide the population with food and medicine. A comprehensive ceasefire is apparently not planned. That is, not everywhere, but in the places where there will be these humanitarian corridors, there may be a ceasefire for the duration of this operation, Podolyak said. At first it was not clear which areas it should be. Fierce fighting is currently going on in several regions, with the heaviest fighting being reported northwest of the capital Kiev and near the eastern Ukrainian city of Kharkiv and the port city of Mariupol in the south. Podolyak was fundamentally dissatisfied with the course of the conversation. To our great regret, we did not achieve the results we had hoped for, he said. We have agreed to continue negotiations in the very near future. The investigative committee into the storming of the US Capitol has summoned the girlfriend of ex-President Donald Trump's son, Kimberly Guilfoyle. The committee has evidence that Guilfoyle was in direct contact with key people and raised funds for the rally immediately before the Capitol was stormed, the panel said. Therefore, documents were requested from the 52-year-old and she was summoned to make a statement. Guilfoyle is in a relationship with Donald Trump Jr. Because Guilfoyle did not keep her original promise for a voluntary interview, she will now be subpoenaed, according to the House Special Committee. We expect her to obey the law and cooperate, it said. The committee has already spoken to dozens of witnesses, but some of those summoned refused to cooperate. Trump's former chief strategist Steve Bannon must therefore answer in court. The same threatens Trump's former chief of staff, Mark Meadows. Trump supporters violently stormed the Capitol in early January 2021, while Congress was meeting there to certify the outcome of the presidential election. Trump had recently incited his supporters at a rally that his election victory had been stolen. 5 people were killed, including a police officer. The chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has launched an investigation into war crimes in Ukraine. On Thursday in The Hague, prosecutor Karim Khan also called on people in the conflict area to report information about possible crimes to the prosecutor. Khan now wants to contact all parties involved in the conflict. He also called on all those involved to comply with the rules of international law. No one in the Ukraine conflict has a license to commit war crimes within the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, the chief prosecutor said. The prosecutor had already announced investigations at the beginning of the week. He will apply for a court order. However, since 39 contracting states have officially transferred the case to his authority, he will initiate the investigation immediately. Among the states calling for the investigation are the EU member states. The prosecution is now investigating possible war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Ukraine since November 2013. This also includes the bloody crackdown on pro-European protests in 2013-2014, the occupation of Crimea, fighting in eastern Ukraine, but also possible crimes since the invasion of Russia. The prosecutor had already established a preliminary investigation before the invasion that there was a legal basis for criminal proceedings. Russia does not recognize the court. Ukraine, while also not a state party, has recognized the court's jurisdiction over possible crimes on its territory in a statement since 2013. China says it has not asked Russia to postpone its invasion of Ukraine until after the Beijing Winter Olympics. Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin called a New York Times report to the press in Beijing on Thursday false news. Such a method of diverting attention and assigning blame is despicable, he said. The spokesman repeated accusations that NATO expansion was the cause of the conflict. Those who create the problem should also be the ones who solve it. Well, I don't know what world he's living in. The New York Times referred to a Western intelligence report. After that, a senior Chinese official told a Russian counterpart in early February not to invade Ukraine before the end of the Winter Games, according to a senior US government official and a European official. In fact, Russia invaded Ukraine only after the closing ceremony on February 20th. At the opening of the Games, Russian President Vladimir Putin met with China's head of state and party leader Xi Jinping in Beijing on February 4th. Both presidents reaffirmed their strategic partnership, as they put it, demonstrated their solidarity against rival USA, and condemned the eastward expansion of NATO. According to the New York Times, the intelligence report did not necessarily indicate that there was an exchange between Putin and Xi Jinping about the invasion. The New York Times had previously quoted US sources as saying that Beijing had been warned several times by the Americans that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was imminent. But the Chinese side dismissed the possibility. Yeah, and here we are. In the face of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a delegation of former US defense officials has reaffirmed US support for free Taiwan against the threat from China. At a meeting with President Tsai Ing-wen on Wednesday in Taipei, former US Chief of Staff Mike Mullen said his delegation came at a very difficult and critical moment in world history. The ex-admiral referred to statements by US President Joe Biden that democracy in the world, like now in Ukraine, is facing alarming challenges. Tsai Ing-wen said Taiwan is joining the joint effort to support Ukraine. How the Ukrainians defended their freedom and democracy met with great sympathy in Taiwan. The island is also on the front line in fight for democracy, said the president, referring to China's growing military threats. History teaches us that if we knowingly ignore military aggression, we only compound the threat to ourselves, Tsai Ing-wen said. The communist leadership in Beijing sees the democratic island only as part of the People's Republic and is threatening to conquer it. Mullen described Taiwan as one of the most vibrant democracies in the world. This delegation reflects the bipartisan nature of support for the strong US-Taiwan partnership, Mullen said. And he said, securing peace and security across the Taiwan Strait is in the interest not only of the US but also of the world. The US stands by its commitments to Taiwan. The US has committed to Taiwan's defense capability and is supplying weapons. Previous US administrations have deliberately left open whether they would also come to the island's military aid in the event of an attack in order to deter Beijing. But US President Biden said the US has an obligation to do so. Another former member of the US government was ex-Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, expected in Taipei also on Wednesday. The international community has condemned Russia's attack on Ukraine by a historically large majority and has called on Moscow to end its aggression. In a vote on Wednesday in New York, 141 members of the UN General Assembly voted in favor of a corresponding resolution, far more than in previous conflicts of a similar nature. 35 countries abstained and only 5 rejected the resolution. In front of the United Nations' largest body with 193 members, the Western allies made visible the international isolation of Russian President Putin. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock wrote on Twitter, "The United Nations say loud and clear, if our peaceful order is attacked, we stand together and act." At the 3-day emergency meeting, the first in decades on Tuesday, Baerbock personally appealed to the international community to rally behind this statement entitled Aggression Against Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky spoke on Twitter of an unprecedented majority. The result shows that a global anti-Putin coalition is in place. It was only the 11th such meeting at the UN in more than 70 years. The minimum target was 100 votes, as in the 2014 resolution that declared a Russian referendum in Moscow annexed Crimea invalid. Other diplomats set the bar for success at 120. Almost never all members vote in the General Assembly, and some of them currently have no voting rights due to outstanding payments. In addition to the historically high number of supporters, Moscow's isolation worldwide is particularly evident in the only 5 dissenting votes. These came from Belarus, North Korea, Eritrea, Syria, and, of course, Russia itself. China, India, and Iran, among others, abstained. What is striking is that at a number of countries under strong Russian influence like Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Armenia, Cuba, and Nicaragua either did not vote at all or abstained. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, "Today's resolution reflects a key truth. The world wants an end to the tremendous human suffering in Ukraine." And British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said the contrast between right and wrong has never been so clear. US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken spoke of a historic and overwhelming vote. However, unlike Security Council resolutions, a resolution adopted by the General Assembly is not binding under international law and has more of a symbolic meaning. However, observers see the Ukraine conflict as a picture of the global mood. The approved text says the General Assembly condemns the Russia's attack in Ukraine, as well as Putin's order to put the nuclear power's deterrent weapons on special alert. The panel requests that the Russian Federation immediately cease its use of force against Ukraine and refrain from any further unlawful threat or use of force against any member state. It also said it was gravely concerned by reports of attacks on civilian facilities such as homes, schools, and hospitals. The International Criminal Court has launched official investigations into war crimes in Russia-invaded Ukraine. This was announced by Chief Prosecutor Karim Khan in The Hague, as I said before. 39 contracting states of the ICC had issued a corresponding recommendation which made the investigations possible. Shortly after the Russian attack on Ukraine began last week, the prosecutor said he was closely monitoring the situation. On Monday, he then announced his intention to launch an investigation, and that's why I bring it up again, because there's something that already happened on Monday. And according to the information, these initially relate to possible crimes that were committed before the invasion. In the view of the spread of the conflict, however, the investigation should be expanded now. The court had already investigated incidents related to the crackdown on pro-European protests in Kiev, as I said, as well as the Russian occupation of Crimea, and everything since then that was going on in eastern Ukraine. There's sufficient basis for assuming that both war crimes and crimes against humanity were committed in Ukraine, the chief prosecutor said earlier. The investigation should focus on possible crimes committed by all parties in the conflict. And in light of the investigation, Khan reiterated his call to all those involved in hostilities to strictly abide by the applicable rules of international humanitarian law. And that is something important. That's why I have it twice in one video. He started this on Monday, and already on Friday we heard about quite a forthcoming investigation here. Parents of a trans child in the US state of Texas have achieved their first success in court in their fight against a heavily criticized ordinance. Judge Amy Clark Meacham issued an injunction barring the state from investigating a teen's parents for sex reassignment treatments. The judge said the plaintiffs were at risk of irreparable harm. Trans people are people who do not identify with the gender they were assigned at birth. The background here is a decree by Republican Governor Greg Abbott. He had directed the state's Child Protection Agency to investigate parents whose underage children were undergoing sex reassignment treatments. Abbott, citing a legal opinion from the Republican Attorney General for the state, argues that it constitutes child abuse. The judge has now scheduled a hearing for March 11th. The question is whether to issue a broader injunction that would block the enforcement of Abbott's order in general, so not only in this one case. In his decree, Governor Abbott names the administration of anti-puberty drugs, other hormone therapies, or surgery as forms of treatment that are not permitted. The Ministry of Justice speaks of a merging of medicine and misguided ideology. Civil rights organizations stormed against the decree and finally took legal action against it. The statement is dangerous, dehumanizing, and frightening for trans youth and will have devastating consequences, the ACLU said. We are pleased with the relief for our clients, but we will not stop fighting to end this abuse of power, the organization responded to the decision. Texas recently caused a stir with an extremely strict ban on abortion. The law, known as the Heartbeat Act, bans abortions once the fetus's heartbeat has been detected. According to U.S. Department of Defense officials, Russian troops are now having trouble getting food for their own soldiers when they attacked Ukraine. A Pentagon official said in Washington on Tuesday, there are indications that they are having problems with supplying their troops, that they are not only running out of gas but also out of food. Overall, the Russians have not made any major progress with their offensive recently. The logistical problems are a factor, but also the resistance of the Ukrainian armed forces, which is greater than the Russian side probably expected. There are indications that morale is falling in some of these units because they did not anticipate the resistance they are being met with, the U.S. Department of Defense officials said. It could also be that the Russian troops took a kind of break of their own accord in order to regroup and reposition themselves and reconsider their own strategy. He stressed that Russian troops would certainly adapt and try to meet the challenges. The attack only started a few days ago. In addition, Russia has large military resources. The Pentagon official said that according to US estimates, more than 80% of the troops that Russia had previously massed at the border are now inside Ukraine. It is unclear why Russia is having such logistical problems with the military attack and whether this is due to errors in the planning or execution of the attack. When asked several times about the information and sources on which the information about problems on the Russian side was based, the Pentagon representative expressly did not comment. He could not make any public statements about this, he said. He said the US estimates as of Tuesday morning that Russian troops have fired more than 400 missiles since the launch of the attack, up from 380 the day before. There is no evidence that Belarusian troops invaded Ukraine as of Tuesday. After the European Union and Canada, the United States will also close its airspace to Russian aircraft. This will further isolate Russia and further increase the economic cost to Moscow, US President Joe Biden said in his first official State of the Union address. Russia's economy is reeling, and Putin alone is to blame for that, he said before both chambers of the US Congress in the Capitol in Washington, looking at the Russian president with that. Biden initially did not provide any information as to when the airspace would be closed. Because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the US, the EU, and other Western partners have already imposed tough sanctions on Russia. They primarily affect the financial system, certain industries, and members of Putin's inner circle, as well as the Kremlin chief himself. Several countries in Europe had already made progress by blocking their airspace for Russian aircraft at the weekend. On Sunday, the EU Commission finally proposed to block the entire airspace of the community. We propose a ban on all Russian-owned, Russian-registered or Russian-controlled aircraft, said European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. Switzerland has also largely closed its airspace to Russian aircraft. In response to the airspace closures, the Russian aviation authority Rosaviatsia announced on Monday that aircraft from Germany and 35 other countries would no longer be allowed to fly over Russia in the future. There could be exceptions with a special permit from the Russian Foreign Ministry, for example. The German regulation came into force at the weekend and affects flights to Germany and overflights, as the Federal Ministry of Transport announced. Humanitarian flights are exempt from the ban. According to the ministry, the ban will initially apply for 3 months. US President Joe Biden wants to fight the high inflation rate by strengthening innovation, targeted investments, and more domestic production. This is better than the alternative because the plan reduces costs, not wages, Biden wanted to say after a previously circulated excerpt from a speech manuscript, and he did. My plan to fight inflation will cut your costs and cut the deficit, Biden said in his first official State of the Union address to both houses of the Congress. We have a choice. One way to fight inflation is lower wages and make Americans poorer. I have a better plan to fight inflation, Biden said in his Capitol speech, according to the White House. It is about improving the infrastructure, ensuring more innovation, and improving transport logistics. And instead of relying on foreign supply chains, let's produce it in America, Biden said. The high US inflation rate of 7.5% recently is one of the biggest challenges for Biden domestically. Although the US economy is booming and the unemployment rate is low, many voters are unhappy about rising prices and partly blame the problem on the government. That's dangerous for Biden and his Democrats 8 months before the congressional elections. His government is trying to lower the inflation rate. Washington can influence many reasons for the rising prices, such as the problems of international supply chains, but only to a very limited extent. US President Joe Biden has announced new punitive measures against Russia and threatened Kremlin chief Vladimir Putin with severe consequences for the attack on Ukraine. Putin has unleashed violence and chaos, but while he may make gains on the battlefield, he will pay a heavy price in the long run, Biden said in his first State of the Union address before both chambers of the US Congress. If dictators don't pay a price for their aggression, they cause more chaos, he said. Biden announced that after the European Union and Canada, the US would also close its airspace, as I said earlier, and this was supposed to isolate them further. And the economic cost to the Russians is getting higher. The Russian president thought he could split the West and NATO would not react then, but Putin was wrong, Biden said. We will continue to stand together. The US president also declared war on Russian oligarchs close to Putin. The US was working with European allies to find and seize their yachts, their luxury homes, and their private jets. We come to take their ill-gotten gains, Biden said. Biden reiterated that US troops would not intervene in the conflict in Ukraine with Russia. Additional US soldiers were not deployed to Europe to fight in Ukraine, but to defend our NATO allies, in case Putin decides to move further west. According to the US government, the Russian attack on Ukraine has led to a closing of ranks within NATO and other Western allies. White House spokeswoman Jen Psaki called Russian President Vladimir Putin one of the greatest unifiers of NATO in modern history. She added at a press conference, "What you see here is a united Europe, a united West, a united NATO standing up against the aggression and invasion led by President Putin." Of course, one would prefer Moscow to take de-escalating steps. However, the demonstrative unity of this coalition sends a clear message to Putin that his actions and his rhetoric are unacceptable. Psaki said US President Joe Biden has led efforts around the world to build this coalition, which includes many countries in Europe, but also from former parts of the world, to stand up to President Putin and stand up against aggression, and to resist the invasion of Ukraine. All these coordinated actions did not come about by accident. Biden will not only lead this coalition, but will also urge a coordinated effort to hold Russia accountable. Biden has requested a $6.4 billion aid package from Congress to help Ukraine. This should include humanitarian aid, economic aid, and military aid for Ukraine's self-defense, said the majority leader of Biden's U.S. Senate Democrats, Chuck Schumer. In the coming weeks, the Senate will put together a solid aid package for Ukraine on a cross-party basis and in coordination with the Biden government. The aim is to adopt the support with the next budget law by March 11th. The planned billion-euro package is independent of the US government's recent emergency military aid for Ukraine with a volume of $350 million. Biden had already ordered their payment on Saturday night. With this tranche, US military aid to Ukraine has totaled more than $1 billion since last year, according to official figures. And I'll see you in my next video. Bis gleich.